Today we're going to discuss Lost Victories, Erich von Manstein's memoir of the Second World War. So, key facts about Manstein to know are he was from a Prussian noble family, high class, born to be a military leader essentially, raised from birth to lead men in war. Fought in World War I, was injured, saw combat on the two main fronts, the Western Front and the Eastern Front. Following the war, he worked in the what was left of the German army in the Weimar Republic, and worked as like sort of a mid-level staff officer. Maybe that's not the right term, but mid-level guy to prepare Germany for whatever was going to happen in the future, just to build out a skeleton of an army with lots of NCOs, lots of officers, not so many enlisted men, and basically just prepare Germany for the time when eventually a strong leader would come in and fund the military, and so they could sort of fill out the military very quickly with enlisted men. So he worked for most of the 20s and the early 30s in that. Then when the Nazi Party gets to power, he, not really clear exactly what happens in the book regarding those sort of interwar years, but he basically just worked as a mid and upper level officer all the way up through the war, and then had a very limited role in the Polish campaign, a decisive role in the Belgian and French campaign of 1940, in that he came up with the idea for the Ardennes offensive, going through the Ardennes instead of plowing through the Maginot Line. And then as the war progressed, he got a higher and higher standing, culminating in commanding Army Group South, which was approximately a third of the forces on the Eastern Front, and essentially is regarded as the greatest general on the German side of the war, and possibly the greatest general of the Second World War. So, yeah, that's in a high level Manstein.
I just want to ask some simple questions first. How does he contrast with some of the other famous generals of the war, in your opinion, compared to people like on the German side, Rommel, on the British side, Montgomery, the Russian side, Zhukov, people like that? How does he compare and contrast?
So as an amateur historian, right, I'm not someone who's read everything there is to read on the Second World War, but for my money, for what I've understand of these other generals you've mentioned, he's the general of the war. He's the brilliant mind of the war. He's sort of at a higher level than these other figures.
So what did he do that made him stand out?
Well, I think that there are two things. At a minimum, there are two things. There's the Ardennes offensive. Like, he came up with the idea for, I think what they ended up calling it was the sickle, in the idea that they would concentrate their forces and do a narrow thrust through the Ardennes and get around the Maginot Line. That won the Battle of France with under 200,000 casualties, if memory serves. Essentially, it took out what they anticipated would be, the big contest in any war that Germany would get into would be, the Western Front, the front that had bedeviled them so much in the First War. You can't give Manstein all the credit for that, but he was a big part of that victory, even though he wasn't, commanding men in the field in any big way in that campaign. People like go ahead.
Would you say he's kind of an innovator? Like, he thinks outside the box, and that was a surprise. Nobody expected that. It broke convention. Or was he just kind of a brilliant operator of conventional warfare, such that he could sort of take, I knew he was famous for liking chess, for example. And so in chess, you basically, aside from the opening part where the white goes first, you have the same pieces on both sides. But if you're smarter than your opponent, you can win. But in the case of war, in the case of, for example, France versus Germany on the Western Front, you have two sides that are sort of asymmetric. They're not equal. And so it's really hard for me sometimes to assess the capabilities of generals when they're given uneven pieces. They have different military technologies. They have different force sizes. They have different configurations. So for me, I don't really know how you actually compare these guys. So was it surprise? Was it just he was just smarter? I mean, just I'll let you go ahead, but I'm curious what makes him so brilliant here.
Right. I mean, what is it in like War and Peace? I think it's War and Peace where they describe how chaotic the battles are, and like the idea that Napoleon was really this brilliant general when he didn't even. It was just chaos all around him. Like he didn't have a clue what was going on. Look, so we don't really know. Was Manstein the best? Was he just pretty good and it worked out for him? Like we can't rerun this simulation repeatedly and actually figure out who was the best. So we don't really know. But we can see what happened. And in my mind, Manstein is more of a timeless tactician than a real innovator. I think people like Heinz Guderian would get more credit in the Second World War for being true innovators. Like apparently Heinz Guderian was responsible for coming up with like this idea of blitzkrieg, concentrated force pushing through the enemy lines, going far behind enemy lines. Though Manstein did do that, and especially in his Baltic campaign, he did operate like 60 miles behind Soviet lines with a large panzer force, mobile panzer force. But I don't know that he's necessarily like super innovative. But he's like a big strategic level thinker more than a tactical level thinker. And I don't even I wouldn't put him on the level of like an Alexander the Great. He was just a very able man more than anything. In his
I don't think anybody compares to Alexander the Great.
Right.
He was pretty crazy.
He's probably not even top 10 of all time in terms of military commanders. He's just a professional, which is good.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like you kind of, all these personalities are just kind of so different because of the different tools that are available to them. Like, you be a great Roman general by just like, inspiring kind of like personal allegiance from your troops, and eventually, inspiring them to declare you emperor. You'd be a great Napoleonic general by, I don't know what Napoleon's secret sauce was, like logistics, I suppose. And like, once you're actually able to move at, a good 20 miles an hour, because now you have internal combustion engines, the kind of operational aspect of like, where do I actually go with what becomes much more important. I don't know how to really compare all of them.
I think that we really can't, but we can sort of see who stands out in each era and talk about them, I guess. But you said something that made me think of some points that Manstein makes in the book, and that is that he always talked about acting in sort of a global context. Like he stressed that the Germans should have tried to take Moscow early, put everything onto Moscow, with the hope that it would actually split the Soviets into two, a north and a south sphere of operation, so they wouldn't be able to do coordinated attacks. He also speaks about like his great achievement was preventing the front from completely collapsing after the Stalingrad defeat. Like they actually very nearly lost the war in the months after that, but he was able to basically juggle soldiers. So we have soldiers in spot A, and they really need to be in spot A, and they're fighting in spot A. But then maybe spot A cools down in a few days, and we can move them 300 miles south to spot B. So he would do things like that. He would cycle his soldiers back and forth to these different fronts, and this is sort of like something I think that they probably weren't able to do until maybe World War I or World War II is maybe the first war where this is happening at quite the extent, because they have the improved communication ability, and they also have the improved transportation ability, rail lines and trucks and things like that weren't maybe.
Was this something that the Russians were not doing? Because as I understand your description, it's basically like the Russians attack in one area, and the Germans don't have enough forces to control the entire front, but they're basically moving in response to where these weak points are cropping up. But were the Russians not also as agile? Were they slower, in other words, in moving their forces to where they needed to be?
I think that's a safe bet. I don't actually have any particular reason to or any particular evidence to back up that position, but it doesn't seem unreasonable. But honestly, I don't know a whole lot about how the Russians ran the war from a high level, like a strategic standpoint.
Doctrine, as I understand it, was I guess you could summarize it by like strategically defensive and tactically offensive. That even when you are being attacked, like your primary goal is to counterattack as massively as possible and make some amount of progress. It's very oriented towards a country that has kind of vast amounts of land to soak up any attacks, and vast amounts of people and gear to waste away, even if necessary, on blunting those advances.
Yeah, the Russians were famous for not really considering the individual too important. They had these infamous blocking brigades where they would set up machine guns to point at their own soldiers who would be shot if they retreated. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with those.
Yeah, I think that was mostly a kind of beginning of the war thing. Like as I understand the kind of turning point, and like Manstein might have some kind of insight into this as well. The Russians essentially had like two of everything, with one of the everything being on the other side of the Urals, and once they kind of were able to get that stuff into action and really fully mobilize all of their forces, in a war of attrition with Russia wins.
Right, and that was one of the points that Manstein makes many times in the book, is that if the Germans were going to win, he uses the analogy of the fencer. They have to fight like a fencer, especially after Stalingrad, when he really says they didn't really have any hope of winning. The best they could do is bleed the Russians enough so that some sort of truce could be signed. But he makes the point that if you're gonna fight a war with 4 million soldiers against the Russians who have 16 million, and you're fighting like man shot for shot, man for man, you're going to lose pretty quickly. And what he wanted to do was retreat, draw the Russians in, sort of like what happened at Kursk, or what he wanted to do at Kursk but was sort of hindered from doing. Basically get the Russians to stick their nose out, have a mass of soldiers that was sticking out, so that pincers could be formed in the basically it would be the north and the south sides of the protrusion in the front, the salient, and then they would cut it off. And they did this with great success in the 41 campaign. They captured 600,000 Soviet soldiers in one huge pocket that they formed. But Hitler wouldn't let them retreat. He wouldn't let them build defensive fortifications behind rivers. He just was not up to this game of back and forth, playing the fencer's game.
Well, I remember in Kursk, for example, the comment I think Manstein made was that if they had started earlier, they would have had a better chance. Does that have something to do with the fact that the Russians could just add more troops per day, or what? Why was that timing so important?